of the Global Nature Positive Initiative at WWF International. I'll be your moderator today for what we hope will be a really good and engaging session with potentially some concrete outcomes as well. So we're looking for narrative sharing and outcomes today. That's going to be quite taxing. Again, looking forward to engagement. Before we get started, I'm just going to show a short video on the screen, and then we'll begin with some introductions. So Dana, if we can pop up that video, that would be great. Great. And if it's possible to put Zoom up as well, if Yolanda Turan is there or available, and we'll come to introductions in a little while. But I'm just going to frame the session first that we have today. First of all, a big thank you to our partners from CARE, World Vision, and Save the Children for joining the discussion today as well. And the discussion is an interesting one because, of course, we're here at COP27 thinking about the agenda, moving the climate agenda forward, and some of the debates and discussions and what we hope for will be some strong outcomes in COP27, although, as we all know, that's really challenging right now. But let's see what progress can be made in the next couple of days. But also, and perhaps not surprising for an organization like WWF, we're thinking about the other side of the coin. Climate, of course, incredibly important, not just to help stabilize our biosphere and avert climate disaster, but also for all of the consequences it's going to have on people, and particularly the most marginalized of society as well. But nature is an important part of the climate dialogue, and it's an area where, even though we've been lacking as rapid a progress on climate, on the nature side of the equation, even less progress, which is really concerning. For example, WWF launched a report yesterday, which noted that about 54% of CO2 emissions in the last decade, instead of driving really serious climate change, have been soaked up by the biosphere, by our oceans, by our forests, by our wetlands. So nature is, in a sense, our secret ally that's been basically buffeting the worst impacts of climate change so far. And of course, nature is also absolutely incredibly important for us to build more resilience for some of the impacts that we are already feeling and will continue to feel on climate change as well. However, there hasn't been as clear a direction on nature and as much progress as we'd like to see. And so there is a very good opportunity in the next couple of weeks in Montreal to agree essentially a 10-year framework, a global biodiversity framework, which sets the direction for nature and for action on nature for the next decade. This is incredibly important. These opportunities don't come along very often. And it's a framework that, if it succeeds, we'll be able to make progress towards implementing the Paris Agreement. If it does not succeed, not only will the Paris Agreement be undermined, but so too will our ability to achieve many of the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So this intersectionality of narratives and agendas is really the topic of conversation today. What's interesting in the context of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity is there are voices there, as there are here. They haven't been perhaps as strong. It's often been technical environmental consultants that have been engaged in that discussion. And as important as that is, what's really key in the climate space is the real diversity, the really broad movement that we have and represented here in the blue zone and here intersecting with governments as well in the climate space. And what we've seen in the last decade is many different kinds of organizations really deepen their capacity to be able to engage in the climate space as well. And we think that, and many others think that we should be looking to learn from that in the nature space as well, so that it's no longer a technical discussion, but it's a discussion about joint agendas, and it's a discussion that will advance not only nature conservation, but it will advance development, it will advance the women's and girls' issues, it will advance health and the prevention of future pandemics. There are many, many intersectionalities that we can discuss. One thing we've noticed in the nature space is that faith organizations, for example, have started to find their voice and interact directly with governments in the policy process. Youth organizations have begun to do that. This has all happened in the last 1 to 2 years. About 350 organizations, including the organizations here today, signed a call to action a few months ago, which we highlighted yesterday, which has also been, again, showing this diversity of this growing movement for nature, for development, for people in the space of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity as well. So it is growing, and there's an opportunity today for the organizations and people represented in the room to also engage as well. And of course, with a couple of weeks left, there's still opportunity to influence the agenda in Montreal too. So those are my kind of quick words of introduction. But more importantly, I think we'd like to hear from the panel members with some of their reflections as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you one by one. One first question, introduction question, introduction on Zoom question, and then we'll do a follow-up question as well, and then we'll open it up to some discussion and see where this might go over the time allotted that we have. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Yolanda Wright, Save the Children International, and Save the Children's been a key partner with WWF on the journey and looking at where our overlapping agendas meet and how we can work together in many, many different kinds of ways. And Yolanda, so just firstly, thinking about climate resilience, gender equality, and inclusion at Save the Children, what's your experience in tackling these challenges, and particularly inequity and injustice for the many years? Based on your experience and what you know about the impacts of environmental degradation on women and girls, can you reflect a little bit on COP27 and these intersectionality of agendas? Thank you, Yolanda.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? So thank you for asking Save the Children to talk about this today. We're a very happy to be partnering with WWF because we completely see that the agenda of child rights and a safe and healthy environment for children to live in absolutely is fundamentally dependent also on a healthy planet, right? There's only one planet. This is where we all live. And I think one of the most exciting advancements in COP this year has been the addition of a children and youth pavilion. I'm pretty sure that every delegate has seen and heard that children and youth pavilion, because it's been a real center of activity, of energy. There's been fantastic things going on, singing and dancing, painting, but also really serious discussions about child rights issues and how children are often on the absolute front line of the climate crisis, and particularly those who experience inequality and discrimination, as you were mentioning. So more marginalized communities who don't have their full rights realized, women who don't have land rights, are often, experiencing the worst of the climate crisis. And I think we have to be looking at a forward agenda where we blend these two agendas really clearly, and where we understand that, you can't have healthy human populations that are thriving in a planet that is really suffering. And I'll just bring a few stories to the fore that will hopefully illustrate this. We work in Somalia. We work in many contexts that are really humanitarian contexts. And I was recently in Somalia, and you can see how the drought, this is now the 5th drought in a row in Somalia. And it's really tested the resilience of people. We've been working on resilient communities for decades. And actually in 2017, there was a number of droughts, but it was just 2 droughts in a row. And with support and early action and anticipatory action, we were able to prevent the worst from happening. But this year, with 5 droughts and a locust infestation, plus the COVID pandemic and conflict, all of these things combining, it's led to a really tragic situation, which is effectively on the brink of famine. And we know that unless we can address the climate crisis at the root causes and also help these communities to build resilience, to look at how do we improve watershed management, and that may well mean creating more positive natural environments upstream, abilities for landscapes to absorb the increasing rapid rainfall. So we're seeing now that rain doesn't come for months on end, but then when it comes in many contexts, it comes in a really heavy rainfall event, and the dry land just doesn't absorb it. The water runs off really quickly. It causes damage to homes and schools, and suddenly children are out of school, children have lost their homes, children and families are struggling to rebuild their livelihoods. So there's a complete interconnectedness between what's happening to nature and what's happening to people. And I think one thing I wanted to mention is Save the Children has, a bit like you, WWF also brought out a report recently. We talked to over 50,000 children in 40 countries. And what really came out from those children was their concern about the interconnected nature of the climate crisis and inequality. And they talked about how unequal the impacts were, how people from lower income families were worst affected and had contributed least to the problem. So I really think that going forward, we absolutely need to bring these agendas together, the rights agenda and the environmental agenda, to try and make sure that we create a planet that we can all live on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Excellent. And now we're going to move to Huwaida Nagi from CARE Egypt. CARE Egypt and Huwaida's work, she focuses on climate smart agriculture and empowering small farmers. And perhaps you're aware, but CARE has been a long-standing supporter of nature, climate, and people agendas, including through a WWF CARE alliance that we have as well together. Just grab my notes. And so the question I'd like to ask you, Huwaida, is bridging the nature and climate agenda. Can you tell us how we can further encourage climate smart and nature positive agriculture? And what's the scope for nature-based solutions, for example, to help achieve social equality and gender equality as well?
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to shed the light on our work towards climate smart agriculture approach and nature-based approach. Actually, Egypt is the most vulnerable sectors in Egypt for the effects of the climate change is coastal zones and the water and the agriculture. In our work on strategy in CARE Egypt strategy to reduce the impact of climate change or to enhance the well-being of small farmers and to achieve sustainable agriculture is built on 3 pillars. The first pillar is increasing resilience. The second pillar is strengthening gender equality and women empowerment. And the third pillar is promoting inclusive governance. Under the resilience, we have an approach to build resilience, which is a holistic approach, starting with investigating or assessing the vulnerability of the communities that we are working with. And this is includes all the communities members who are affected from the problem and who are in need for the change or to shift to be more resilient, and also engaging the key stakeholders in the communities, from government, from researchers, from institutions, and from the communities themselves. So they come together all together in an approach that is called climate vulnerability assessment and capacity analysis. It's a participatory approach that is starting with analyzing the problem and collecting information around the problem and meeting all the communities to examine the problem that they have in their communities and affect their livelihoods, and analyzing this problem and meeting all together to validate what they came up with from the data collection and analysis. And after that, identify the needs and also propose a solution. These solutions we take this solution to be a locally led initiatives funded by CARE. And also working, of course, this will be through our partner organizations on the community-based organizations that we work. We are not working directly with the beneficiaries. We are empowering partner organization at the grassroots level that they are very aware of the needs of their communities and can actively engage and communicate with their constituencies. After part of the locally led initiatives that we implement is to encourage them to use or to embed the climate smart agriculture approach, which is a very good approach, a holistic approach for the best management of resources, either water, cropland, and fisheries, and also the forests, or not in Egypt, but it's one of the resources, the natural resources. We have a real example under our projects that we are currently implementing in Upper Egypt, that we build the capacity of the organization and the beneficiaries of small farmers and women to be able to anticipate, adapt, and absorb the risk and the shocks that they have, and even to transform or to create enabling environment to transform from traditional practice to climate smart agriculture practice. We have on the ground the use of or recycling the animal waste and agriculture waste to use it in a form of compost. And also use agriculture waste and after adding some salts and mineral salts to be fodder for the poultry and livestock. So it's a good example for using the natural resources and recycle it to have a new form of a very of a good product that is have an economic return for them, and also reduce the effects of the environment, because in the past they used to burn this waste in their fields, which has very bad effect on their health and the environment, and also increase the emissions. So by using recycling this waste to produce a new product that is have economic return and also environment friendly, so this is what was a good model and replicated in many villages and districts that we worked in Upper Egypt. We have also a good example of empowering women to be in the agricultural value chain system, which is, we have a very good example of the pomegranate processing in one of the villages in Upper Egypt, Asyut. If anyone knows Asyut, this is a village, this is a district, one of the governorate in Upper Egypt. We empowered women there, and they have received training, and they will became and provided them with job opportunity to work in a food processing system. And they started to use every part of the pomegranate, even the peel, they transfer it to cosmetic and something product for the hair, and also produced the molasses from the pomegranate, and also they use the seeds to produce oil. So there were no or zero waste in this model, which has good effect or good model for creating nature-based solution. These are one or some of the examples. Also, we had a lot of examples. We encouraged them to use the solar panel in irrigation, and also we encourage them to establish early warning system to provide climate information and to be more resilient to the effects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nawaida. Yeah, from SAVE, we heard some of the challenges in Somalia and some of the inequities and the impacts that communities are feeling. So it's really good to hear the response to some of those challenges in the kind of empowered way through climate smart agriculture that you're pursuing heavily here in Egypt as well. I only wish we could spend more time seeing little parts of Egypt rather than being in this conference center, but here we go. Let's move on now to Tony Ronaldo, who's the Principal Climate Action Advisor with World Vision. My pleasure to introduce you, Tony. Thank you for making it today. And over the past decade, biodiversity loss has undeniably impacted people's lives, led to increased poverty, social inequality, and the most vulnerable populations, of course, being hit hardest and tragically. Having experienced COP27 through World Vision's lens, so you've been here a few days now, could you speak more to the potential and urgency to increase the resilience of marginalized households to climate change shocks through improved management of natural resources?
Thank you, Gavin, and good morning, everybody. In terms of potential, it's simply enormous. Firstly, to protect the remaining intact natural areas, but secondly, there are at least in excess of 3 billion hectares of degraded land worldwide with some level of potential for restoration. And many of the world's most marginalized people depend on these landscapes for their livelihoods. In terms of urgency, people are starving today. There's displacement, poverty, hunger, and often resource-fueled conflict over these diminishing resources. I've had the privilege of coming from Marsabit County in northern Kenya just a week or so ago, where the situation's so dire. Not only are the people hungry, many of the livestock have died. There's one report, 170 elephants starved. So it's very, very severe 3 to 4 year drought that's going on there. And yet the communities that have started to restore their landscapes, there's a method that we're promoting called farmer managed natural regeneration. So regenerating the tree stumps and the seeds already in these landscapes. The communities that are doing this are much more resilient. And so maybe they don't have the full potential of their livestock during the drought, but they can draw on honey, they're keeping bees, gums and resins, they're keeping poultry, and they can sell fuel wood. So they're much, much better off. And I'm sure that when the drought ends, they'll recover much more quickly. They have more resources in reserve.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. Thanks for sharing that. And we'll follow up with a couple more questions going deeper into that. Incidentally, a side note, in some parts of Kenya, keeping bees is a really good way of keeping elephants away from your crops. The two are not compatible, so there's sustainable honey farming and also dealing with human-wildlife conflict at the same time. So species can coexist with people. Now, lastly, and online, it's my great pleasure to introduce Yolanda Turan. Hi, Yolanda. Yolanda is with the Indigenous Women's Network on Biodiversity, which is based in Latin America and or focuses on Latin America and the Caribbean. Yolanda's also been the Indigenous representative for Latin America and the Caribbean to the United Nations since 1994. So working at the intersectionality of Indigenous people and women's rights and women's issues. Yolanda, hopefully you can hear us okay, and thanks for joining us at this very odd hour for you in Quito, I believe, or thereabouts. Could you please share with us Indigenous women's perspectives to the questions we're discussing, especially in the context of upcoming biodiversity negotiations? Over to you, Yolanda.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I am a member of the Indigenous Network of Biodiversity from Latin America and the Caribbean. That is an organization that was created 22 years ago. So by saying that, I'm trying to explain that the organization was created because we wanted to include the needs and the perspectives of Indigenous women. And has been very difficult because, as you know, always as Indigenous people, we need to fight and we need to make pressure in all levels to be visible. Always, it seems that in any discussion, the people forget about us. So we need really to be putting attention and following these meetings to make sure our inclusion. In regard to the coming meetings in Montreal for the COP15, we have been working almost every day. We have meetings very early in the morning to discuss the new framework and to see how and to include our views and perspectives. Considering, of course, our conditions, worldwide speaking, the poverty, extreme poverty, the lack of the enjoyment of basic needs, many Indigenous people suffering without food, without water, without medicines, different things that the violations of our rights, our life insecurity, different situations that put pressure on us, especially as women, really to advocate for our resilience, for our survival. And this is why we are emphasizing in the inclusion of the human rights framework in the new biodiversity framework. We need to ensure also the inclusion of safeguards because we need to protect and care the Mother Earth, considering that she is not a merchandise, but she is alive, she is sacred, and together with all her beings. So for us, it's a life compromise. Since we are children, we learn how to defend ourselves and how to protect the Mother Earth. So as women, we have that compromise on us. We organize ourselves. We try to educate and to share with our people at local, national, and international levels for them to understand what is this, what is the meaning of biodiversity, why we are discussing this, why is important this new framework, and why we need really to be there trying to express our perspectives and to include the voices of women, but as Indigenous women. In the meeting in Panama, in the pre-COP, we were a lot of women participating there, and we make sure that in the targets 21 and 22 of the new framework, the inclusion of the full and effective participation of Indigenous women, girls, and youth. This is so important. Yeah, we see in the text in women, but it's not the same thing because we have different realities and different necessities. So, and by saying full and effective participation, that means that we want to have voice. We don't want just to be sitting there. We want really to express what we need and what we want as Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. And I think we're going to transition now, and Yolanda Teran has taken us in this direction from what we're doing at the community level to work with and empower and work alongside people from around the world to what are the frameworks globally that are going to help us with our agendas and with the challenges that we face. As you heard Yolanda there, who's been more closely focused on the Convention on Biological Diversity and its Global Biodiversity Framework, key language within frameworks becomes really important to us. So I'm going to pivot now to the other Yolanda on the panel, having two Yolandas, Yolanda Wright, not Yolanda Turan. And Yolanda, a follow-up question. So as we start thinking about this global biodiversity framework and the idea of putting together a strong multilateral direction for governments, what are some of the elements that you'd like to see that will enable you and empower you and your colleagues at SAVE and the partners you work with to be able to fulfill your goals, your mission as an organization?
Thank you. Well, I think I'll echo the other Yolanda's points. I think you can never have too many Yolandas. Is that for us, fundamentally, the thing that's needed going forward is a rights-based approach. I mean, Save the Children is a rights-based organization. We try to work really strongly on child rights, but I think a fundamental rights-based agenda is probably a really common thread for all of us. And, you know, particularly to consider groups that are normally less well represented. So I think children for sure, youth, women, indigenous groups, etc., all need to have a really fundamental clarity on that a rights-based approach, and that their voices will not just be heard, but actually actions will be taken and people will be accountable to those groups. So this is a really important thing we've seen here at COP, is that I was very happy about the Children and Youth Pavilion and an increased participation and involvement of children in the agenda here. But how much are they actually influencing the decisions? Are they just here and talking in the sort of pavilions and the marginal events, or are they having a right to really be heard in the decision-making processes, and then for those decision makers to be accountable? And I think the same thing applies for a forward agenda for nature, that we need to make sure there's good language and then there's good practice of what rights really means. That means a right to participate, not just to be sort of a tokenistic, you know, a tokenistic agenda. I think another thing that's worth mentioning is that we have to have sort of economic rights as well as land rights and other things. And I think one thing I found really interesting in terms of new approaches is looking at how we make sure that communities who are on the front line, but who are also guardians and stewards of nature, are given support they need to do what they want to do. So, for example, Save the Children is working in Vanuatu. We've just got the largest locally led adaptation grant through the GCF. And we want to absolutely work with local groups, but they can't just be expected to do the physical labor, to like replant mangroves, to consider how they restore nature without actually providing financial and economic support to do so, right? So I think making sure that there is an economic support as well as a kind of rights-based approach, I think is really important, because when we're talking about lower income communities that are on the front line at the moment, many studies show that they're having to use their own resources time and time again to build their own resilience. And what we need to look at is, well, who's got their financial resources to support the lower income families, because for sure we shouldn't be expecting them to be paying the most for some of the crises that they have not created. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. And some key elements there that I could see could emerge in an advocacy towards the framework itself, and real challenges there as well. I heard a couple of numbers echoing through the halls here in the last days about how little of the funding there is flowing is actually getting down to the community level as well, just a 10 or 20%, depending on the different numbers, very hard to measure. But the people on the front lines that are suffering the most need to have the capacity to be able to engage as well. So let's move on to Hawaida now, and a very similar question to you. You talked earlier about climate smart agriculture and some of the great work that's happening across Egypt here. What needs to happen in the multilateral framework globally, particularly through the CBD, to enable you to scale up and accelerate some of the efforts that you're promoting here in Egypt?
Thank you. Actually, the continued loss of nature and positive solutions is threaten our opportunity to reduce poverty and address social and gender injustice. So I think care also, or even any humanitarian or development organization that put on the center of focus the well-being or the people in poverty, or the interest or of all the people, the vulnerable people. So I think the change should be is to integrate a right-based approach, or to impose a bottom-up bottom-up approach that reflect the needs of the societies and the people, the vulnerable people, and transfer their requests to the decision makers to take into consideration their needs, and to transfer all their needs into actions and decisions. I think we should push all the governments to have a mission, or to commit them to have a mission to keep or to protect the nature, and to embed nature-based solutions to keep our planet, because we don't have another option. We have only one planet. We don't have other planet to live in. So I think this should be all governments should be committed to put in place actions and plan to be just not to be plan, but just to be have actual implementation or transfer into implementation. I think we need to move from just promising. We need to move to actions. So I think all policymakers and should take into consideration to have in place people-centered and gender equitable solutions towards nature-based solution. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. We're capturing these as well and take some extensive notes. So Tony, a very similar question to you from World Vision's perspective and mission and vision. You're present in an awful lot of countries around the world, which is fantastic. What would you like to see multilaterally that will help you unlock your potential to achieve your vision as World Vision?
So when you remove vegetation from landscapes, you're just left with bare ground, and it's useless for nature. It's useless for the human beings trying to make a living off that land. And not only does that land stop sequestering CO2, it's actually emitting for the burning of the biomass and the volatilization of the organic matter. So in my work in drylands, in agricultural settings where they've restored the land, they're sequestering about a ton of CO2 per hectare per year, and in forest settings about 15 tons. And I listened to a talk here at COP just the other day. Egyptian conventional agriculture is emitting about 5 tons per hectare, but biodynamic agriculture is sequestering 15 tons. And yes, it's good. I hope that governments get on board and promote and enable these kinds of activities, but we shouldn't ignore our own power as consumers. We have choice on where we buy our foodstuffs and agricultural products from. There's no get out of jail free card. We still have to stop emitting as quickly as possible, but I'd like to see much more action on the nature space. When we're working with nature, we can have an enormous impact and possibly reverse climate change. It's estimated that if we restored 1 billion hectares of that degraded land that I mentioned earlier, we could draw down anything between 16 and 25% of existing greenhouse gases. That's enormous. And it's not a moonshot. This is achievable. We've seen that in the field. So I'd like to see much, much greater action now, quickly and at scale. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tony. And moving over to you now, Yolanda Taran, Indigenous Women's Network and Biodiversity. So you already touched on some of the elements you'd like to see in the global biodiversity framework. Can you go into a little bit more depth about how we could make that framework much more ambitious than it is today?
Well, we have different factors to consider in this. To me, it's a complex question. We could have ambitions on one hand, but on the other hand, we need the goodwill of the politicians, the governments, but also we need the education of the whole community. We need to work in a collective way, really first understanding the cultural meaning and the real meaning of the earth, of Mother Earth. And then understanding that we need to change our attitudes, daily attitudes, in many ways. As indigenous peoples, we act, we think, and feel in an holistic way. So sometimes it's difficult to understand that, but we act like that. And so I think that there are several things that still we need to make pressure, and we need to see in the new framework. For instance, one of the big issues for us is the change of the perspective in the conservation. What is conservation? Well, we keep saying that how the conservation is doing now is disrupting our cultural areas because there is a violation of our rights, and there is a superposition of different cosmovisions. So this is why there is a violation. There is no respect for our ways of being as indigenous peoples. That is one thing. The other thing is we need really to put a lot of effort and to have a collective action really to protect the flora and fauna that is on the land and also on the water. For indigenous peoples, it's very important. We could use the plants and animals for our daily consumption, but also for our ceremonies, for our traditions, for our culture. And so the lack of these native plants and animals is really making negative effect in our cultural identities and roots. I hear from the previous speakers that we need to implement, we need to do the things, but for indigenous peoples, it's so important to get direct funds for indigenous peoples and local communities, but also include resources for women. Generally speaking, the women are put aside, so we really need to be included in this, and we need to work together to understand that we are capable now really to manage and administrate funds. And as my sister from Egypt is saying, we need to empower the local communities. We need to empower the indigenous peoples. Like how you are going to empower? When you trust the people, when you believe in people, when you have faith in people, and also when you respect them. And so there are so many things that we need as indigenous peoples. For instance, the working group on Article 8 related to traditional knowledge should continue the working, of course, with some changes. And also we need to respect and include the different system knowledge of indigenous peoples. And we need to think carefully how we are going to get an equal access and benefit sharing. We need to ask if the national frameworks are ready for this. Are we discussing enough about the new biotechnology that we ignore the effects? And as indigenous peoples, we are behind this because there is a big gap in capacity building. So we need to invest also in capacity building, which is culturally appropriate for indigenous peoples. And so in regard to gender, in our languages, we don't have the word for gender, but we speak about the roles, the social roles of indigenous women and indigenous men, and the way how we could be working together. Trying to get the things done, but together, and also including everybody, the children, the youth, the elders, and always the elders in front of us guiding our work. So I will stop that there, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. And we're capturing these points as well. I am going to attempt to summarize some of these key elements, but before I do that, I'd like to open it up to some questions from the audience to any of the four panelists today. Any questions or any reflections on what you would like to see at the multilateral level to enable us to help kind of unlock the actions that we need at the local level. Please. And I'm going to be doing double duty with the microphone running as well.
Thanks, Kevin. My name is Tuba and I'm from World Vision Australia. Same team with Tony. And my question is slightly, I mean, it's different, but I'm addressing the panelists as well as our WWF representative here. Working at multilateral level, and I'm glad that you have a panel of Save the Children, Care, and World Vision. And having worked with WWF for many years, I see the kind of move from conservation towards more active restoration and working more with communities. So it's a very encouraging move. Now, how can we work together in this sphere at that global level to unlock some of these capitals or resources together is another thing that I'm interested in, because, for example, in Myanmar, WWF has adopted FMNR, farmer managed natural regenerations, without us pushing. So it's an organic spread and an organic partnership, and it's successful. Now, if we are more intentional, maybe we can achieve more success. So that's a question for all of you and also for you, Gavin. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Good example from Myanmar there. Does anybody want to reflect on the question, Tony?
Thank you. Just very briefly, it's so exciting for me. For years, I've wanted to work with a conservation organization because we complement each other. World Vision tends to have very good relations at the community level, and we have their trust and engagement. And I'm sure World Wildlife Fund does as well, but your strength is in conserving and protecting nature. And to have that collaboration in Myanmar, and also we're just starting off a mangrove restoration program with WWF in the Solomon Islands. So for me, it's really exciting. It's long overdue, and I look forward to see where it leads.
Thanks, Tony. Other reflections, please?
One reflection I would just have is just to talk a bit, come back to children again, and a little bit of, again, reflect on the points that Yolanda was making, the other Yolanda was making about capacity building. One thing I think is really important starting point is children and education of children. So again, another thing I think is a really common agenda for all of us is that potentially we could be doing a lot more. And we do have a partnership with WWF in some schools in Myanmar and Cambodia, where we are having nature clubs, working with local organizations to provide after school support for children that helps them to start engaging with nature, to start understanding how soils work. Why is this soil holding water and why is this one not? And talking about, you know, science and risk. And it's a great way for children to start engaging in how the world works, how they, you know, how nature and human beings are interdependent. It's a great way to add to the curriculum because you're learning about science in real life. You're not sitting in a classroom in the same sort of formal way that a lot of children are still educated. You're getting into groups and active work. So I do think there's an interesting way in which you can start some of this collaboration really early in children's life, and far too few governments have a sort of curriculum that involves teaching children about nature, biodiversity, climate change. And I think actually there's quite a move here, I hear at COP, to kind of create that education for everybody, actually, even universities. You know, I think it's essential that we understand the interconnectedness of people and planet. So I just think that might be an interesting entry point.
Great, thank you. Please.
Thanks so much for this great conversation. My name is Venta Mongera. I work with Africa Biodiversity Network. I'm relating to a number of issues. We are based in Kenya, but we have partners in 21 countries. One issue that I would like to reiterate on is the opportunities to partner in scaling up the solutions that are already in the societies, in the communities, for example, empowerment of communities to build their resilience on control or conservation of loss of biodiversity. Also empowerment of indigenous communities. These are some of the areas that we are intervening in, but now the challenge is how do we sustain this? Because already in the communities, the solutions are there. How do we scale up? How do we collaborate to scale up to another level so that now we can achieve this participation where all are giving their unique contribution to conserve biodiversity while also looking for food sovereignty. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. How do we scale up? The eternal question. Anybody would like to reflect on this one?
So the method that I've been mentioning, and Tuba mentioned, farmer managed natural regeneration, it's spread across the country of Niger at a rate of 250,000 hectares per year for 20 years. Much of that without my knowledge, because it was a farmer-driven movement, a people movement. And today World Vision is wanting to support the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So their goal is to restore 1 billion hectares of degraded land. And to that effect, we're mounting a campaign and activities in countries where we're piloting networking with all entities, government, other NGOs, community and faith-based groups, and so on. Give them the information and the awareness on this approach, set up a pilot to bring people in and see for themselves, learn, and then follow it up. The idea is not to create a project with a fixed geographic location and limited budget, but to release a movement, give the information, give the inspiration, and because people benefit directly when you work with nature and restore it, nature benefits and the people managing and living off that land benefit. When you facilitate them to do that, then it just moves on its own power. So that's the approach that we're taking, and we welcome collaboration in that area.
Thanks, Tony. Any final question or thought from the panel? Well, thought from the audience, sorry.
May I say something?
Oh, please, yes, go ahead, Yolanda.
Yes. Regarding to the last comment from our sister, I would like to say that our network has been providing capacity building for the whole region in Latin America and in the Caribbean. First, to make them to understand what is traditional knowledge, what is the role of it, how we are going to protect the traditional knowledge. And then we speak about biodiversity. And we found out that, again, in our languages, we don't have the word biodiversity. So we have to work with local languages to find a word or the concept about biodiversity. So when they understand this, then they become very strong locally. And after that, the following step is really to work nationally and then internationally. This is why we are now participating in Montreal, in Switzerland, in Nairobi, but this is like a school. No, we try really to visualize what is happening outside the communities, how these happenings are going to affect our survival. And then when they are sure about those teachings, then they decided, we have already young people that now are working nationally, and for Montreal, they for the very first time are coming outside from the community. So, and I believe that we need to keep doing that. It's very important to share with our grassroots communities what is happening in terms of climate change, biodiversity, the Nagoya Protocol, the Cartagena Protocol, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists for excellent presentations. And also especially to Yolanda Teran for staying late to participate in this panel. Doris Mpumu, I'm the director of the AU Liaison Office for Save the Children, based in Andes. But what I'm going to say is actually on a personal level, based on my experiences as a Congolese woman, a small country in Central Africa, but also from engagements with various youth groups and children in relation to my work. I want to touch on two points. The one mentioned by Yolanda Wright, my colleague, on education and the importance of knowledge, traditional knowledge that the other Yolanda mentioned. In the African culture, that what we're calling a traditional knowledge or the knowledge of nature comes naturally. But what I'm also hearing from young people from where I work, there has been a cultural imperialism that has undermined what Yolanda is calling traditional knowledge. Knowledge is knowledge. So knowledge, whether it's indigenous, whether it's children's knowledge or youth knowledge or women's knowledge, it's knowledge and it has to be recognized. I remember going to visiting my grandmother and my grandmother asking me to go buy oil in to the market. And she will hand me a bottle, a glass bottle to have them to buy the oil, which is what I'm seeing in many countries now, including in New York. You go buy cereals and you you bring your container. But at the same time, in our communities, plastic was introduced where we were using. So this is just to say that there is indigenous knowledge, there is knowledge that is out there, and it has to be respected. And we need to learn from that, all of us. There's nobody that has the knowledge. We all have knowledge and it needs to be fastened. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any reflections on how to draw on traditional knowledge from any of the panelists?
I guess only just to agree with you that it's essential. If people are really going to own the process, they need to be respected for what they know. And even though I've been doing rural development work for nearly 40 years now, every time I go back to the field, I'm learning much more than I give. So respect it, understand that they do have incredible knowledge. They've survived and thrived in environments where we wouldn't last very long at all. And we need to build on that knowledge.
Point in just sort of a point to support that those points, both from Yolanda and my colleague Doris, to say that one of the things I think is a big barrier when we talk about climate change and biodiversity is this issue, though, that to access funding, the knowledge required to access the funding is very rigid. There's a very formal process, very lengthy processes for writing proposals and getting access to finance. So I do think it's just worth flagging that. I totally agree with the points you're making, and I think we should be continuing to push. How do we make sure that finance, not just support and knowledge, but actual finances really reaches organizations on the absolute front line, because there's a constant barrier to them accessing finance, which is linked to this issue of whose knowledge and whose type of knowledge is respected the most and can get access to finance. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we are pretty much out of time, unfortunately. I'm going to just attempt to summarize some of the main points that we've touched on in the last hour in the journey that we've taken. We've heard obviously a very strong push for rights-based approaches to be absolutely integral to any work that is done at the community level. That has been, of course, embedded already globally. I think many of us think it needs to be embedded in the global biodiversity framework, and then we need to be ever vigilant at the local level that it is respected. Too often there is no free prior informed consent when development is taking place, and obviously that needs to change. And in particular, indigenous people's perspectives and women's perspectives are often even more marginalized. So that's something that's shone through in some of the comments and some of the thoughts and sharings today as well. Ensuring that, to the last point from Yolanda, support is there for communities and it flows to communities is essential. I've been meeting with governments, ministers in the last days, talking about COP15 and the Global Biodiversity Framework. There is appetite for new funding to flow. The EU is really stepping up on making much more funding available with success in Montreal, the German government, French government, the Canadian government, and others as well. Of course, we've got to make sure that new funding is available. It's not, and that ODA is not the only source of funding. There are many kinds of business models. That is one, and make sure that that reaches the ground as well. We've heard that, for example, support for nature-based solutions with a caveat, rights-based approaches and the right work on the ground as well, and be careful how they're funded, but they can work in the right context, in the right circumstance. We've heard strong support for restoration as well, and restoration not only helps communities become more resilient, but can also soak up an awful lot of carbon as well and make a really big contribution to the Paris Agreement. We've also heard a strong call for better access and benefit sharing, whether it's kind of biotech eyeing local knowledge or local flora and fauna, and then also, of course, local traditional knowledge as well needs to stay with the guardians of landscapes that have lived there for millennia. Those are some of the points. Perhaps the last one is on the mission. We do need to know where we're going on nature, and having a clear and common direction and commonality of purpose is really important. And then, of course, all of these are elements that could be in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but it doesn't stop there. Hopefully there will be an agreement in December in Montreal, and that's where the real implementation work begins. And that's where the partnering can continue and should deepen as well. We're, of course, as WWF, we're very open to partnering wherever we can, and many thanks for the positive feedback and support that I've heard in the room today. And of course, partnering goes both ways. We're really interested in working with others, learning from you, and together untapping our collective potential. I'm just going to ask the panelists now to just think of a couple of words about how you're feeling about the potential for some success this year that will set us on the way multilaterally. So just 2 words, because I'm getting a very strong signal that we're out of time. A couple of thoughts and then we're finished.
I would just say our new campaign is called Generation Hope, and I think we have to keep that idea of hope alive, because I think that's absolutely fundamental to achieving what we want to achieve. Thanks.
Hope alive. Thank you.
I just say that we all need to have collective actions and the role of civil society and the youth and women who are most vulnerable groups. So always always neglected and not part of the decision making. They should be engaged and with any discussions around active change for their groups and their communities, and be part of the change as well.
Great, thanks. Strong voice for youth. Brilliant.
Yeah, just to reiterate what was just said about hope. Hope has 2 beautiful daughters: anger at the way things are, and courage to do something about it. So hope.
Brilliant. And Yolanda, the last word goes to you.
Yes, thank you. I believe that we need to work together to join efforts. And also we need to be very clear about the concept of inclusion trust, respect, and mutual understanding. Thank you.
Thanks, Yolanda. Thanks to all the panelists here today, and thanks to the audience for coming and sharing your questions as well. Thank you very much.